All right, here we go for Instagram. So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this special edition of Teh Tarik, episode 8. And I am in the presence of greatness. Beside me is the legendary Professor Yenn, the author of This Is What Inequality Looks Like, which was a national bestseller and it sold, what, 30,000 copies? 34,000 copies so far, and hopefully a few more after this. So we will be discussing Professor Cherian and Professor Donald Lowe's book, PAP versus PAP. We will start in about 2 minutes with them, because we are doing this over Zoom and Instagram at the same time. Okay, so be patient with us. There may be some technological issues on our side, especially. So, Prof, do you want to say anything first?
Just to say good evening. Thanks for joining us this evening. We're very excited to be talking about Donald and Cherian's book. And I hope lots of people have already read it, and if you haven't, that your interest will be piqued after tonight.
Yes, definitely. If you haven't, you must. I think it's one of the must reads for Singapore politics. Together with This Is What Inequality Looks Like as well, of course.
Thanks for the plug, huh?
All right, so today, feel free to ask us any questions. You can ask me questions over WhatsApp as well. I have it on my laptop, and you can just type in the questions here. We will wait just a couple of minutes, and then we'll get them on so that we can start it together with Zoom. You guys can hear us?
Mm-hmm. Can you hear us?
Hi.
Hi, Cherian. Hi, Donald.
Hi. Yeah, hello.
Yes, we can hear you very well. Okay, so let's begin. Welcome everybody to this book launch come Teh Tarik session organized by academia.sg and myself. So today I am extremely privileged and honored to have three of the brightest minds Singapore has to offer. Okay, Professors Yenn, Professor Cherian and Professor Donald Lowe. So just for this session, I'll call you guys by name because there are three professors. We will be discussing this book, PAP versus PAP. If you haven't gotten it, it's already sold out. But you can get it in about 2 weeks' time, hopefully. And you can order it online as well, right?
Yes.
You guys are still accepting orders? Yes.
Our printers have worked very fast, so it's already back in bookstores. It's no longer sold out, fortunately.
All right.
You didn't keep it sold out for a little bit longer.
All right, so we will be taking questions from the audience as well, if you have any. So you can ask us over Zoom and over Instagram as well. So maybe as a start, I mean, you guys know all three of them. If you are here, you know all three of them. So I don't really need to introduce them. Just to say that we are all here in our personal capacity. Right. And so let's begin. Maybe for a start, both of you can just briefly summarize what your book is about and why it's important. And just briefly and in layman's terms, maybe we can start with Donald, because you have Chinese privilege.
Yeah. Actually, when we wrote the book, the two things that weighed most heavily on our minds, of course, were the pandemic and how it's shaped or reshaped or altered significantly Singapore's environment, right? In terms of deglobalization, in terms of moves towards a less carbon-intensive, more sustainable, a more low-carbon economy. And also in terms of the disruptions to supply chains, which Singapore is so much a part of. And of course, the second big event that we were, commenting on was general elections 2020. But now that the book has come out and we have had a chance to sort of sit back and think about, trying to contextualize the book, I think in many ways the book can also be read as a defense of Singapore's system of elite governance. And one of the reactions I've gotten from many of my friends is, why have we written a book that tries to legitimize, defend, justify Singapore's system of elite governance? So maybe you allow me to spend a couple of minutes explaining that. The first is, I'm a beneficiary of elite governance. Cherian and I, we won government scholarships. I served 10 years in the Singapore Administrative Service. As elite as it gets, I then had the privilege of, teaching at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, training the next generation of Singapore's elite civil servants. So I'm very much a beneficiary of that. But the second more important reason, I think, is that if you look around today's world, which is your question, Walid, one of the major issues we face is that in the last 5-6 years, we've seen really a nativist, populist backlash against elites, right? Against governing elites, political elites, business and corporate elites. And that's making the world a darker, more and an uglier place. And it's making in this world, I think Singapore's system of elite governance actually, by comparison, is going to be our comparative advantage. It's going to be our competitive advantage. And so, when you look at the American elections, the recent elections, for instance, you realize that, what we've seen in Trump's dystopia is really a democratic revolt against, technocratic expertise, against expertise more generally. And so we thought it was important in this context to kind of come up with reasons why we think this system of elite governance shouldn't be abandoned, right? Even if it needs to be tempered with more democratic deliberation and democratic engagement, but it should be strengthened and preserved. And so, and so in that context, we've tried to, organize the book in 3 parts. The first is really around the context, right? And the pandemic, and the challenges that throws up, and how it has hastened the trends that we already saw at the end of the global financial crisis. The second part focuses on the kind of policy reforms we need to sort of cope with this post-pandemic, and also the world that hyper-globalization has produced, right? So our second part is called the economic and social justice. The third part is really the kind of longer-term political reforms, systemic reforms we need, whether it's around forming our media system, remaking our media system, whether it's in terms of, democratic reforms, more progressive ways of policy making, and how would we, forge a democratic consensus in this more, polarized and in this more potentially more partisan society. So that's how I see, how to contextualize our book in the given the kind of challenges and changes we see around the world maybe for the last 10 years since the global financial crisis. I don't know, Cherian, you want to?
Chip? Now, of course, you don't need to buy the book because it's so well filled.
We cannot hear you very well. We heard Donald quite well.
Okay, is that better? I think closer.
Yeah, a bit better, yeah.
Great, thank you very much. So I'll just add to that. I think one interesting set of responses that we've already received, and it may surprise you to learn that this response doesn't come from the conservatives, right? It's not from the hardcore PAP end of the spectrum, but actually from the opposite end of the spectrum. And on reflection, I guess it's not surprising, because what you see in Singapore when we are broaching this big topic of PAP reform is 2, in a sense, very different responses from either ends of the political spectrum. From the PAP conservative end, we get...
Cherian, I think...
How's that? Is that better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay.
Is that the same for me as well?
Right. Yeah. So where was I? Okay. So from the PAP end of the spectrum, the more conservative PAP end of the spectrum, there's the predictable response that reform isn't needed, right? At the other end of the spectrum, the strongly anti-PAP end of the spectrum, the reaction has been, quite uniformly, that reform isn't possible, right? And it's understandable why both of these groups, don't find our argument particularly appealing, because we're actually saying that reform is needed and may be possible. Yeah, and this, I think, is something that mixed reaction, to put it mildly. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for that introduction. I think since you've already mentioned the word reform of course is at the center of the central thesis in your book, that in the near to medium term, the reform of politics is crucial to Singapore. And you contrast this to reform of policies. You make the distinction between reform of politics, and reform of policies. Can you now explain a little bit what the difference is between reforming politics and reforming policies, or perhaps how you see the two as linked, and then tell us a little bit more about this central thesis and why you think it stands?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with reforming policy. You're right, Yenn, we certainly made that distinction. I think for me at least, and Cherian can chip in, policy reform does not require sort of significant ideological change on the part of the PAP, nor significant change with respect to the political system, right? The way politics is conducted. Policy reform is the substance of government, whereas political reform, I would say, refers not just to the style of politics that the PAP engages in, but also a reform of, political institutions. And the way politics is conducted. So policy reforms, in my view at least, which is the second part, occupies a big part of the second part of the book around economic and social justice, is well within the PAP's ideological reach, right? It's well within their ideological range. And policy reforms that we talked about there would be things around expansion of social safety nets, making social spending more universal, inequality reduction, wealth taxes. I think those are well within the PAP's, ideology, and we've got a strong state, a competent bureaucracy that can quite easily, implement these things in a sort of incentive-compatible, efficient sort of way. Political reform requires, a different set of orientations, right? It has to do a lot more with institutions, right? Political reform involves institutional change. So maybe I'll toss that difficult part of the question to Cherian.
This is something that I've been thinking about for some time. Personally, for me, it struck me very strongly after the 2011 election. Yeah, because the striking thing about the grievances that became election issues, whether it was transport or hospital beds, or property prices, public housing prices, or immigration, which the PAP, very quickly acknowledged, even in the course of the campaign and soon after, that these were in fact serious problems. None of them, not a single one of them, was new. Right, for years, Singaporeans have been expressing their grievances about this, and evidently just wasn't taken seriously. So it struck me at that point, sort of the 2011 election, that while the post-2011 response by the government certainly showed their technocratic ability to solve many big, serious problems once they understood they were problems. There was an important part of the post-mortem that didn't seem to get done, which is the harder question of how did the PAP slip up in the first place when all of these issues were known to the vast majority of Singaporeans for years before grievances, spilled over into electoral outcomes. I don't think this question was ever satisfactorily answered in the post-2011 landscape. And the can was kind of kicked down the road precisely because the government, in reaction to the 2011 disappointment, did recoup some of that credibility and authority by doing a decent enough job in solving those problems. Yeah, but that question mark was still hanging. It's always was. How did they get caught out so easily? And if you ask around, whether it's public servants or people close to the government, you keep getting the same response. Yes, there were people in the system who knew. And yes, of course, there were other Singaporeans who were trying to tell the government that these were problems, and yet there's something not quite right in the way that these grievances translated into policy, and that exactly is, to put it very simply, is a failure of politics. The other striking case to me that again suggests that the PAP wasn't getting its politics right was in the 2013 white paper on population. Right. Again, you saw an instance of where this is not. The PAP, in a sense, had no excuse to be taken by surprise, because by then, surely everybody knew that the number one hot button issue in Singapore was immigration. The population white paper was touted as probably the single most important consequential document, blueprint for the future. So the government had more than a year to prepare for it, right? And in spite of this not being like a pandemic situation which took everyone by surprise, this was entirely planned. Again, you found the government stumbling, right, getting it wrong in terms of its ability to get its message across, that very toxic 6.9 million figure, which I think anyone with a sense of the political ground should have been able to understand that this would not, this would go down very badly. Right? You had the rather embarrassing situation of where the government's motion in Parliament had to be amended before it was passed, in spite of the PAP's dominance. That's how badly this, the white paper went down, right? And more recently, you find the same mistake being made that in the this year's general election, despite the PAP knowing that that jobs was what it wanted the people to focus on, it quite unnecessarily stumbled into the population issue by making a hash of the 10 million figure. Again, something entirely preventable, a huge distraction, and not a productive debate, because so much of that debate had to do with misunderstandings and miscommunication and clarifications and so on. That shouldn't be what policy making is about. So why is it that we haven't been able to debate population properly? I think an honest analysis of where we've gone wrong has to include, I wouldn't say that it's purely the policymakers' fault, but surely it has to include political clumsiness. And I think a lot of the what we discuss in the book is trying to understand that political, sometimes naivety, sometimes willful blindness. But we're convinced that the PAP can do better.
Sorry, Prof, can you put it nearer your
sure.
Yeah, okay. This is good.
Sure. Yeah. We're convinced that the PAP can do better on the policy side if it gets its politics right.
Right. Okay. So I think most people would agree with your argument, right? Most people listening would agree with your argument, right? The problem is that's the ideal that we want. How do you see us getting there? Because there's a saying, right? Frederick Douglass said, "Power consists nothing without demand." And externally, even though this was one of the PAP's worst showing, they still got 61% of the vote. So it doesn't seem like there's an external demand. And internally, the PAP is a cadre party. It's very tight-knit, ideologically homogeneous. So internally, it doesn't seem like the change is going to come from within as well. So where is the change going to come from? And is your book written more in hope rather than in expectation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, Walid, you're right that societal demands for... Yeah, so also the PAP, as Cherian was suggesting, tends to view its technocratic competence as somehow, it has to be insulated from democratic pressure, has to be insulated from democratic scrutiny. So it's not as responsive as we would like it to be to political signals, right? To the signals that elections like those of 2011 and 2020 sent. So I think, Walid, you're absolutely right. Both in terms of societal demands and also in terms of the PAP's capacity to respond effectively and respond quickly to political signals from elections might not get us that change, right? I mean, the third reason why I'm also somewhat not that optimistic about the PAP's capacity for change is it's been a very successful government. It's been a very successful system. Anybody who's read Clayton Christensen's the Innovators Dilemma would understand this. That success makes change risky. It breeds inertia. It breeds ideology and a certain intransigence. And the people who succeed in that system, they're not bad people. They're actually very competent, but competent within that system, right? So they have very little incentive. In fact, they have all the incentive to resist fundamental change. And the fourth reason why I'm not so hopeful about change is, Walid, I just read your paper co-written with Terence Lee of NUS, and where both of you argue that GE 2020 is probably not a sufficient unfreezing event, right? Sometimes you need a large crisis, right, or a large enough, consequential enough crisis that will unfreeze present behaviors and reshape orientations and priorities. And both of you argue that GE 2020 plus the pandemic probably do not constitute that unfreezing event. So in that sense, I agree with you, Walid, that change is not a foregone conclusion. Democratization, PAP's internal reform are probably not my central scenario. But having said that, somebody still has to make a case, right, for why it is desirable for the PAP as well as for Singapore's long-term interests that we have an adaptive PAP, right, rather than a maladaptive one, rather than one that resists change. Somebody also has to make the argument that in light of the contentious, perilous times we live in, there are parts of the Singapore system that work well, right? What I call technocracy, right? And what we need is really a better balance between technocracy and democracy, right? Rather than to view it as the way the PAP views it, that the only way to ensure a good technocracy, a strong technocracy, is to somehow suppress or limit democratic pressure. Because I think if you do that, in light of complexity, what arises from the suppression of democracy is the combination of technocracy and an increasingly complex world. And what you get out of that is a kind of meritocratic, technocratic elitism of the sort you see in the Davos variety. And what is the reaction of the masses, right, to that sort of Davos elitism? It is the revolt against expertise that we see in Trump's dystopia. So I think this is why, increasingly as I think back on why we wrote the book, I think that's the argument we're coming around to, right? That too much is at stake, right? This is really a very consequential period in Singapore's history. We're faced with unusually challenging and perilous times, and more so than ever, we need to strengthen our system of elite governance, of technocracy. And the way to do that is to buttress it with greater democratic legitimacy rather than to try to suppress democracy.
Right. So there are a lot of people on Instagram asking whether the issues just now were PAP trying to silence the both of you. I assure everyone it's not. Okay, Revolt has nothing to do with this. It's just technical difficulties. Yeah.
Yeah, I wondered if you can say, you use this phrase revolt against expertise, right? And you're making a case that somebody has to defend technocratic elite governance, yeah? And I wanted to push you to say a little bit more about that. Like what does that mean exactly, and why we should be afraid of revolt against expertise? What is it what is the context in which we're in that we fear the alternative? What does the alternative look like?
Well, the alternative, when you have a rejection of expertise and you have a democratic revolt against technocratic governance, and is, as I say, Trump's dystopia, right? Where people still have to vote, but they don't feel that they have benefited from the system of globalization, the system of meritocracy in the last 20, 30 years, and they use their vote to as a way of sticking the middle finger, right, to corporate, financial, and political elites, right? So I think that's what I mean when I say a lot is at stake, because the failure of politics does not herald the failure of democratic politics does not herald the rise of a technocratic golden age, right? Rather, it's more likely to create figures like Trump, and we shouldn't underestimate the likelihood of that, even for Singapore, right? Where precisely because in Singapore we've tended to view politics as somehow unseemly, right? Somehow something that shouldn't infect our system of sensible, rational, long-term technocratic policy making. And I think that sort of argument is likely to build resentment against that very system that has produced the kind of stability and prosperity in Singapore, the kind of technocratic governance.
Cherian?
I do hope that readers don't miss this point, because it is an idea that is somewhat different from the standard critique of the PAP's directions over the last few decades, right? The PAP has been challenged as being against liberal democracy and so on, and most of that challenge comes in the form of celebration of the popular will, right? The popular will against elites. I think it is important to understand, and it's taken the world some time to realize that people power is only a very partial definition of what democracy is. That democracy is yes, partly defined by majoritarian rule, right? So it's a numbers game. But democracy is also defined by a very different pillar of equality, where the rights of minorities, for example, matter even if the majority opinion is against them. Right? Democracy is also defined by, for example, the rule of law, where decisions of a certain kind need, in fact, to be insulated from public opinion and the popular will, whether because these require certain managerial expertise, or because decisions have to be made on principle and law rather than what is popular. So democracy is all these things. Unfortunately, the dark side of the advance of democracy over the last few decades has tended to emphasize majority rule at the expense of, for example, rule of law, minority rights, and the principle of equality. What is new in Singapore is that some of those, in what for shorthand is called populism, has actually been unleashed over the last few years in a very worrying way. If you look at the history of the PAP, this is the last place that you would expect populism to take root, because Lee Kuan Yew and his cohort were nothing if not anti-populist. A lot of what they did in terms of adapting Westminster-style democracy to the model that we have now was precisely about insulating managerial expertise, political leadership from the vagaries of public opinion. He was avowedly anti-populist. And you would have expected that the PAP stuck true to that, to perhaps to a fault, right? But in recent years, what we've seen is that the what some scholars call the populist temptation that has gripped countries from the US to Europe to the Philippines to India and so on. We've seen elements of this take root in Singapore as well. We've seen the PAP indulge in the populist temptation in worrying ways. This is where, for example, it uses a very irrational kind of nationalist logic to beat down critics, where it is prepared to push aside rights-based arguments, by simply saying that, well, that's not how the majority feel. All these are worrying symptoms of where the PAP is in fact losing some of its anti-populist roots. And of course, you could say that Lee Kuan Yew and his cohort took elite governance to extremes as well. It was not responsive enough to public opinion. But there are, we're entering this strange phase where both things are true at the same time. In some ways, the government is technocratic and elitist to an extreme. In other respects, it seems to be prepared to play with this fire of populism in ways that are worrying. I think what we've tried to do is to sound the alarm that this is not good for Singapore, and it's certainly not good for the PAP either, because I think our argument is that if you let this populist genie out of the bottle, the PAP is in fact extremely ill-equipped to deal with it, right? They're not going to be good at this game, so why not stick with the game that they are actually good at, which is to use its to be the trustee of the public, rather than simply to play with this populist fire, to use its expertise to gather the best available people to lead the way by the force of example, rather than playing this shallow numbers game. So it may seem that this is an extremely conservative idea, to actually celebrate the elite technocrat in the PAP. But I think we should clarify that we also argue that this also needs to be balanced by, for example, more competition, more transparency, and more openness. Because of course, the excess of elite government can go horribly wrong as well.
Can I?
Maybe I could add on. So Cherian has laid it out very well. There are indeed two strands in a functioning liberal democracy, right? First, as he says, is the majoritarian strand, right? The idea that legitimacy comes from popular sovereignty. It's majoritarian strand. And second, there is the pluralist, liberal, or equality strand, right? Which is about separation of powers, the importance of independent institutions, including a professional, non-partisan, neutral civil service, right? The rule of law and all of that. And, democracies do best when they hold these two strands in a sort of healthy tension, right? In a healthy balance. If you let one side, the majoritarian side, become too strong relative to the liberal pluralist strand, then you risk sliding into populism. Of the sort you see in Hungary, in Poland, in Turkey, in the US, Trump's America. If you let the liberal strand, right, or the pluralist strand, run riot and with no respect for democratic will, right, no respect for popular sovereignty, then the risk is a kind of technocratic elitism, right? For a long time, we thought that was the major risk facing Singapore. But as Cherian says, and in the last chapter of the book, we covered this, the PAP riding the populist tiger. Now there is also the risk of, right, populism, right? So we face risks on both excessive majoritarianism or leaning or pandering to majoritarian sentiment, as well as the older risk of, elite governance taken to extremes, right? The sort of tyranny of merit, the sort of tyranny of elitism that Michael Sandel talks about in his new book, for instance, right?
Can I ask why do you think the term populism is a good way to describe what's going on? So there are two parts to this question. Firstly, surely not all forms of populism is bad. I mean, Bernie Sanders and AOC would be considered populist as well. Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, it depends on which side of the spectrum you're on. And secondly, isn't the very definition of populism people rallying the masses against a corrupt elite or establishment? Yeah. So how can the PAP be populist if by definition they are the elites and they have always been the elites? It may be quibbling about terminology, but I'm just curious as to why you chose the term populist. to describe what's going on with the debate?
That's such a good question. Well, it's so good that I actually anticipated it and read up on
So
where
that
the
means you're better, right?
no, I'm not that elite. So the term populism arose in the late 19th century in America during the Gilded Age, high levels of inequality, crony capitalism. So it referred to the Populist Party was actually the People's Party that actually fielded candidates, a president and vice president candidate in the 1892 U.S. elections. And they won about 10% of the vote, carried 4 Western states. The first time since the Civil War, American Civil War, that the third party team had won electoral college votes. And what was the platform of this populist party? What was it? It was a left-wing agrarian populist party. It stood for supporting the interests of farmers. They tried to appeal to laborers in the cities. They weren't very successful, but they're quite successful in the south, in the west, which were mostly farming districts. They were for things like establishing a currency fiat, having expansionary monetary policy. But above all, they were about curbing financial and corporate interests. Right. So you're absolutely right. I mean, in today's context, it would be someone like Bernie Sanders, AOC, whom we would call these are left-wing populists, right? But what we've seen alongside that left-wing populism is a kind of right-wing nationalist, aggressive, reactionary, certainly xenophobic in Trump's case, in Oban's case, even in Modi's case, ethno-nationalism, right? So a kind of aggressive right-wing reactionary populism. We don't get to choose these terms. We use these terms because that's how politicians like Duterte and Oban and Trump are described. So that's on. But you're absolutely right, Walid, that not all forms of populism are bad. I mean, to the extent that it's a movement against the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of elites, right? Corporate, financial, political elites. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Duterte's popular support rests a lot on his anti-establishment credentials, and if you know how unequal and how corrupt, right, those financial elites can be, you can kind of understand why he rose to power. I think the problem with the sort of right-wing populism is that although they claim to represent the will of the people against these establishment, against these corporate and political elites, what do they actually offer in substantive terms, right? In policy terms that would actually reduce inequality, that would cut down that concentration of power. Secondly, these populists are not particularly committed to the liberal aspects, the pluralist aspects of democracy, right? They undermine rule of law. They challenge the idea that minorities have rights and liberties, right? And as we are seeing with Trump, when they lose elections, even though Trump didn't win the popular vote, right? So he won the elections in 2016 on account of a system, the electoral college vote system, that is designed to prevent tyranny of majority. Having got into power on the backs of the liberal, right, pluralist strand of democracy, he then attacks it. And now in this election where he's clearly lost the election, suddenly even the majoritarian democratic aspects of democracy he does not support. So in other words, the problem with populists is not that they rail against populists. It's not that they are against inherently popular sovereignty. It's that when the results don't turn their way, they say that they still represent the popular will. They still represent the people. It's this deep state that is subverting, that is undermining that popular will, right? And that is very problematic. So populists are against, or populism represents a threat to democracy in very specific ways, right? It is not necessarily a threat against this idea of majoritarianism, against this idea of the popular will. It is this attack on liberal institutions. And when I use liberal here, I want readers to be very clear. We're not talking about liberals as opposed to conservatives, which is how we usually use the term. We are using liberals as opposed to authoritarian governance, right?
Right.
We're using liberal in the sense of liberal constitutionalism, right? Protection of rights, especially of minorities, protection of our liberties, separation of powers, rule of law, independent institutions. Yeah. I don't know. Cherian, you want to add on to why populism is?
Maybe I'll just add to that the international dimension, right? I mean, if Singapore was in its own bubble, yeah, and was in complete control of all the dynamics that affect its own society, then I wouldn't be that worried about the way in which the PAP plays with these majoritarian arguments, right? The way it, for example, silences the LGBT rights lobby by saying that, oh, the majority are not with you, and the kind of argument that it uses against many critics, oh, these are just a small group, the popular will is against you, and so on. It's no big deal. I mean, that's kind of normal politics. What worries me is the international dimension, because we're a small country, right? We cannot afford at any level to play the numbers game in a way that's not balanced with principle, yeah, with rule of law and very clear notion of rights. We cannot afford to, because we're surrounded by much bigger countries. Yeah, if you look at where these forces are probably the most frightening, they are in India. Yeah, such majoritarian tendencies in the form of religious nationalism and so on is likely to seep into Singapore. Ethno-nationalism is on the rise in mainland China. It is likely to seep in Singapore. What is going to protect Singapore society from these very strong tendencies in societies far bigger than us? It is nothing other than a very a clear consensus in our country that no, the numbers game in fact does not matter. We are sticking with principle. It doesn't matter that 1 billion people tell us we're wrong. We still feel we're right. Right? We need that kind of instinct. We need that kind of sensibility in our bones, among policymakers, but also among ordinary citizens. Because if you don't, cultivate this very strong sense that civic values matter, that human rights matter, and so on, I don't think we'll be adequately prepared for the kinds of arguments that are going to come our way from outside of Singapore, that we should bend this way or that, because after all 1 billion people can't be wrong. Yeah. Fortunately we have time to do that. A country like the US, which of course is very much in the news right now, in some ways it's almost too late to put the genie back in the bottle. It is too late, I think, to rebuild trust, to restructure the economy. It is not too late for Singapore. It is not too late for Singapore. We can, in fact, get the politics right in this very, very important way, as well as the economics right.
Thanks very much. I think you've both painted a really sort of concrete as well as comprehensive answer around why this is so important now. I wanted to go back to the observation, Cherian, you started with, that there is a fair bit of skepticism among the audience about the possibility of reform, right? And I wondered if you could say a bit more about what do you think are the tendencies and capacities within our current system that indicate the possibility, and specifically, because you've mentioned institutions, what are some of the things that exist in our institutions that point to possibility? And secondly, Cherian, because Cherian raised the question of, sorry, both get me on Instagram.
Yeah, actually it's okay. Yeah.
Cherian, you said that what we need is not just the institutions, but also a certain sensibility, maybe a certain political culture, right, among ordinary people. And so I wonder whether you could say something, or whether you would like to comment about the possibility of reform, not just from the perspective of the PAP's the PAP's own internal dynamics, right? But also, what is the role of civil society? What's the role of ordinary citizens in this?
Yeah, the possibility of reform. Well, I think one thing you got to understand about Donald and me, right? We don't have actually that much in common. Different biographies. We are similar in two, I think, significant ways, right? One is that we didn't go to Raffles Institution, right? We are both Hwa Chong alumni, yeah. And I think Hwa Chong alumni have a certain characteristic about them. Number one, we're quite accustomed to not being in the center of power, not being right all the time, because that's RI territory, right? So the other thing that we have in common is that we're both Manchester United fans, right?
Yeah.
So
you
what
both
if
have terrible taste. Yeah.
Well, not quite. I don't know. I don't know what Newcastle fans can say about that, but still, why is this important? It is important because I think for both of us, we're quite comfortable siding with apparently lost causes. Yeah. If we weren't, we would have tried to get into RI, and we would be supporting Liverpool or Manchester City, right? So the fact that people tell us that you're just dreaming, there's so little chance that the reforms that you're in favor of will actually materialize. It cuts no ice with us. It's okay. We're all right about pursuing things that we believe in our heart, even if the majority don't, and so on, right? The other important thing about our book is that we're not making predictions, right? We're not saying that the PAP probably will reform. In fact, as Donald mentioned earlier, chances I think are quite slim. It's just that we just feel an obligation to push for that change, even if chances are slim, right? So we're interested in the possibility of change because we think it's something good for Singapore. And the same is true whether we're talking about reforming the centers of power within the PAP or the wider society. I mean, of course, there are many discouraging signs, right, of a society that is overly materialistic and what else, if you ask people outside of Singapore, they'll say that we're a soulless society and so on. And maybe that does, in fact, characterize a large number of Singaporeans. But no, I think we have met more than our fair share of Singaporeans, young and old, who are idealistic, who are prepared to work for the common good, who are doing all kinds of interesting things on the fringes, right? They too are not bothered by the fact that they didn't go to RI, right? So, but and these people are there, right? They're not necessarily heralded in the media. They're not necessarily looking for fame and fortune. There is so much to be encouraged by in Singapore. So where can this head? Our own hope is that these Singaporeans who understand that a society is not just built on tribal loyalties, that a society isn't just built on looking after your family or looking after people who are like you. It also depends on the obligation that we owe to strangers, people who are different from us, and even people we don't like. Yeah, does this define the majority of Singaporeans? Probably not. Are there enough of such Singaporeans to do great things for Singapore? Absolutely. Yeah. What is stopping them? This is where I think again we need to come back to government policy and the space that government gives to for example civil society. It still is not enough. It is still a very narrow view of what kind of citizen engagement is welcome. Things that might inconvenience policymakers is not welcome, and these attitudes need to change, because we do need to unleash the not just the economic entrepreneurs, but also the social entrepreneurs in Singapore, who are treated very differently from the economic entrepreneurs, and that balance needs to be redressed, I think.
So the book is not really a call to action, but it's a pouring of your heart based on whatever you just said.
Is it sorry? The question was: is it a call to action or? No, it is a call. It is a call to action. It is a call to action, but I guess we're not the kind of people who would issue a call to action only if we think we're going to win. No, right?
Right,
I mean,
right.
even if there's just a slim. Yeah, exactly. As Donald said, it's precisely because we think that this is not really a vote winner, right? This is not easily marketable idea. That's why we are almost duty bound as academics, as writers, as thinkers, to raise these ideas that are not going to be put forward by many politicians, because it's not necessarily going to win votes. It is not necessarily going to be put forward by business, because it's not going to make money, right? But that doesn't mean that these ideas are wrong, right? And that's what we're pushing.
Okay, so shall we take a couple of minutes break while we sort out some issues as well, and we can do the Instagram thing?